Hi fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creators will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Hello there, fantasy fiction fans. So, an anchorite, A-N-C-H-O-R-I-T-E, and the female of that is an anchoress, is a person who has chosen to withdraw from society. The word comes from the ancient Greek anchorites, which means someone who has withdrawn from the world. Anchorites differ from hermits in that they enter isolation after a religious service of interment. And this might resemble a funeral rite. And this is so that they can be considered dead to the world, and therefore they act as if they are a living saint. The anchoritic life became widespread during the Middle Ages, and there were a large number in England. The anchorites were normally isolated in a simple cell known as an anchorhold, and these had often been built against the walls of a village church. In German-speaking areas of Europe, it was customary for the bishop to say the office of the dead when the anchorite entered his or her cell, and this was to indicate that the anchorite's death to the world had occurred and their rebirth into a spiritual life had begun. Some anchorholds had a few rooms and perhaps even some attached gardens, and of course the anchorites themselves couldn't feed themselves. They couldn't bring their own water in. They obviously couldn't go shopping. So servants tended to bring in the basic needs for the anchorite, and they provided food and water through a tiny hatch, and they removed some of the soil and waste. One of the most fascinating aspects of these anchorholds is that they were often considered to be a communal womb, which offered an idealised sense of a community's reborn potential. And so from this communal womb, the anchorites would provide spiritual advice and counsel to the visitors they had through the small window or hatch in their cell. And therefore they tended to gain a reputation for imparting wise words of wisdom, and they played an important part in the local community as a guide, as a counsellor and as a mentor. Now, it's well known across the world that self-isolation brings a person inner peace and the possibility of quiet and deep contemplation. Although other religions have priests or monks who separate themselves from everyday life to seek truth and spiritual clarity, no other religion has had anything like or as extreme as the anchorites. I know that we now have not chosen to be isolated in this lockdown period, but since we are isolated, I think perhaps it's healthy and reasonable to look at the positives rather than to complain about the negatives. The 14th century English hermit, mystic and religious writer named Richard Rolle, who met a famous North Yorkshire anchoress, Margaret Kirkby, undertook to identify the principles of an anchorite way of life, and he listed the benefits. We've been bequeathed these good ideas from Richard Rolle, and they are ideas about the advantages and the compensations that come through self-isolation. And so I'd like to finish this little piece with those perspectives that are most relevant to us today, and I think heartening to hear too, especially as we respond to the challenges brought by a period of self-isolation. So these are presented in my own words, and they bring my own conceptions on the idea, but with thanks to Richard Rolle. Living humbly and calmly brings a person closer to love and patience. Exchanging transient pleasures for deeper meaning brings a person a more permanent sense of spiritual resilience. Being isolated from society brings the pleasure of devotion to a higher consciousness. Isolation allows us to reflect on the shortness of life, and with those reflections, it allows us to accept that we must account for the hours that we have. Purity comes when we submit to the will of external influences which we have no control over. Isolation helps us fix our minds on what is true and fix our hearts on what is meaningful. And an isolated person will discover that she or he has time to improve wisdom, improve knowledge, improve faith, and other important skills. Hi fantasy fiction fans, and especially writers of fantasy fiction. This week I wanted to talk about epic. What makes something epic? And what are the ingredients of something epic? Our word epic comes from the Latin epicus and the Greek epikos, which means words that make a story or a poem. Somehow along the way we've taken the word epic to mean long or even overlong, and perhaps even arduously overlong. So for example, when we talk about we've been to an epic journey to the shops, we might be talking about a journey that was laborious and lengthy, and therefore our friends would murmur sympathy and be glad that they didn't join us on such an arduous quest. If you're reading or indeed writing a epic fantasy novel, however, then you'd expect something that offers more than just long and arduous. You'd want something that offers you extraordinary daring-do, exceptional heroics, immortals and superhumans and average humans working together for the common good, complex mythologies, a re-examination of morals, rhetorical and figurative language, and also probably rhapsodic romanticism. Now, if you test the Lord of the Rings against those criteria that I've just said, then I think you'll agree that the Lord of the Rings ticks each of those boxes. Therefore, it's an epic fantasy fiction novel. Several experts, including the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who lived 384 to 322 BC, have attempted to outline the main characteristics of epic. So here's my shot at it, and I want you to test your own novel or your own idea for a novel against this list, and also test your favourite fantasy fiction, not Lord of the Rings, but another of your fantasy fiction favourites against the list, and see how many it ticks off. So here's my list. It's in my own words, not in Aristotle's word. Number 1, epics must have an obvious moral theme. So think of Star Wars. In epics, the action starts immediately. We're dropped right into the action, right into the middle of events. So think Star Wars again. The setting will be vast, and it will encompass a multitude of nations and realms and even worlds. So think of Game of Thrones. A prophetic goddess or enchantress or sorceress might be the catalyst or the spur for action. So in this case, think of the Chronicles of Narnia or the Arthurian legends. The main characters will have epithets. So what I mean by that is the Man of Steel or Gandalf the Grey. Epics contain lists. Sometimes the lists are quite long and useful. So, for example, think of the list of demons in Milton's Paradise Lost. Epic heroes will recite long and formal speeches. So perhaps think of the Shakespearean speeches. Epics demonstrate that superhumans and aliens and deities can work together to overcome evil. So perhaps think of Lord of the Rings cycle. And in epics, the protagonist will embody the best principles or the best virtues of civilization. So think of the King Arthur legends. And finally, an epic will often feature a tragic hero's descent into an underworld or into a hell on earth. Does your fantasy fiction have some of those ingredients? If it does, then welcome to the world of epic fantasy fiction writing. Hello fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to my list of absurd yet insightful fabulous creatures. So in heraldic representations we often see chimaeras, chimaeras, such as the hippogriff, who has the body parts taken from various different animals, portrayed in heraldic shields and in illuminated scripts, etc. The word chimaera, which actually means she-goat in ancient Greek, was originally used to describe a fearsome-looking lion/goat/snake monster that breathed fire, but has since been used to describe any fantasy creature that has been made out of various parts of leftover body bits, or is considered delusionally imaginative, or is considered to be ridiculously extravagant, or is considered to be simply mind-blowing. The good thing about the original chimaera, the goat thing, was that this monster personified and embodied the attributes of its original component body parts, namely the bravery and ferocity of the lion, the sneakiness of a snake, and the obstinacy and persistence of a goat. Other chimeras that are in daily use include the sea lion, also known as the morse, M-O-R-S-E, that has the head and upper body of a lion, but the webbed forelimbs of a fish. Therefore, it is predatory like a lion, but skillful underwater. And although it's a legendary creature, it also embodies the attributes of a lion and a fish. The sea lion is also tangible in a real-world sense, inasmuch as it's both physically and stylistically exactly the same, a sea lion. Slightly less tangible, yet totally recognisable, is the mermaid. The mermaid is a human woman with the tail of a fish, so stylistically she's beautiful but slippery. Understandably, we might associate the sirens of classic mythology with the idea of a mermaid, but surprisingly we'd be wrong, because the sirens of Greek mythology were half women, half bird chimeras, and not half women, half fish. The switch to an aquatic type swimming creature came later when many of the Christian bestiaries were compiled, and it's possible, though I'm only guessing, that these later compilers didn't want mermaids to mingle with the much holier angels. There's also a sense and a sensible line of thought that the early sailors might have seen groups of seals, or less likely or much less likely manatees or dugongs, languishing on rocks and singing, and they thought they'd seen half human, half fish creatures and named them mermaids. But back to my own list of preposterous yet insightful creatures, and perhaps inspired a little bit by J.K. Rowling's Fantastic Beasts, written of course as you know by Newt Scamander, which included several recognisable chimeras such as the manticore, which is a lion/scorpion, the hippocamp, which is a lion/fish, and the griffin, which is a lion/eagle. But also I'm probably more inspired by Fryer's new Dictionary of Heraldry. I've created my own set of chimera that make sense stylistically, even if they don't make sense physically. These creatures that I've created make sense stylistically. So my set of chimera might be distinctly improbable, and they certainly will be highly wondrous, but they're quite functional and perhaps even workable if you wanted to use them in your fantasy fiction project. And of course you can use them if you want to, even though I've conjured them up out of thin air myself. And if you do use one or any of them, it'll be great if you could credit me. But more importantly, I'd like to know, or I'd love to know, that you've used them or have even thought about using them. And tell me on Twitter or on Facebook at Neilmach, Neilmach, all one word, .me, and I would love to share. Of course, if you create your own chimera, which I also recommend that you think of doing, then tell me about that as well. So here's my list. Now, in order to use this list properly, you'll need to go to my show notes, which are Neilmach, Neilmach, all one word, .me, and you'll probably need to search for fabulous creatures. If you put a search in fabulous creatures, you'll get a list of all of the body part creatures, the things which have dedicated their body parts to my chimaera. And when you look down that list of body part creatures, you'll see the attributes of that creature. And I'll give you an example. So my first one on my absurd list of insightful but fabulous creatures is the packrock, P-A-C-K-R-O-C-K. And this is half alligator or half crocodile and half wolf. So if you were going to search for that in my show notes, you'd look up alligator, and the attributes of an alligator is he's heartless and merciless. And if you looked up wolf, you'd see that he is vigilant and protective. So a vigilant and protective creature who's also heartless and merciless is a packrock. Right, here we go. Here they are, the other ones in my list. I'll leave it to you to look up their attributes. Number 2, Sinis tiger. This is half alphin and half vulture. Wrasse squirrel, W-R-A-S-S-E, Q-U-I-R-R-E-L. This is half hedgehog, half badger. Ursignus. This is half bear, half swan. Triumphallo. This is half deer, half wild boar. Taurus slimy. This is half bull and half salamander. Cormorant. This is half cormorant and half pelican. Worshippercock. This is half pigeon, half peacock. Claw spray. This is half harrier, half hawk. Muscougar. This is half deer, half panther. Pelt sensitive. This is half otter, half ferret. Blackaddigger. This is half greyhound, half nebec. Sylfaster. This is half hare, half melusina. Pantherodron. This is half lioncell and half martlet. And finally, Magriffon, M-A-G-R-I-F-F-O-N, which is half magpie, half vulture. Good luck with those. My absurd list of insightful but fabulous creatures. Wildflower of the week. This week, Britain's favourite flower, the bluebell. Now, if you want to find a unicorn, go to a bluebell wood in springtime. That's my advice, and I'll come on to that in a minute. It's said that when the blue-blooded Prince Hyacinthus was killed in a game that went fatally wrong, bright blue flowers sprang up from the forest floor. They sprang up from his blood. His lover, the god Apollo, shed divine tears that marked each of these new flower petals AI, which means alas. The British bluebell, Hyacinthoides non-scripta, has often been described as Britain's favourite flower. When I was young, my family used to make an annual pilgrimage to one of the several bluebell woods near where we used to live in Surrey. And we did this so we could see the amazing sight of what is known as the blue of the wood. And we would greedily collect bunches of this wonderfully aromatic and magical plant, which, when it comes out of the ground, looks like a spear of asparagus. The folk belief was that if you pulled the flower stalk away cleanly, and they often used to make a little squeak, a little yelp as you pulled them out, the bluebell would not be harmed. And this folklore has since been proven to be true, although if you trample all over the plants, which we were careful to avoid by the way, but if you trampled all over them, this would harm them and it would be difficult for them to produce more flowers the following year. But if you do pull the whole stalk out, then it's quite happy with that and it will come up again the following year. I still remember how exciting it was to bring bunches and bunches home and to vase them up and to take them to our rooms and to enjoy their warming fragrances for a few days. And although it was sad that the bluebells themselves gradually faded away, they left behind small seed pods kind of round seed pods, and even that was quite exciting to watch the change from a flower to seed pod. When I moved into my current cottage home at Penton Hook, where I'm speaking from now, here by the River Thames, we had British bluebells growing in sturdy bunches by our front door. We also had a witch-scaring elderberry by the corner of our house. But a couple of years ago, we had to redo our paving in our front garden. And it's very nice and efficient too, I might add. We did it with stone blocks. But in the process of those extensive groundworks, we lost our faithful old elderberry bush and we lost the bluebells. In fact, they dug down about 4 foot, with machinery, and then refilled all that with various different things like aggregate and gravel and that, and then obviously put the stone blocks on top. But nature is miraculous, because this year, and through a little crack in the stonework, and after an absence of 2 years, a bluebell has just appeared. I'll take a picture of it and put it on the show notes for you. Common British bluebells, also known as wild hyacinths or woodbells or fairy flowers or blue bottles, but my favourite word for them is from Somerset and it's grigglesticks, 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 ought not to be confused with harebells, Harebells, although harebells are known as bluebells in Scotland. I'll cover harebells in another show. But bluebells are a perennial plant that grow from bulb and appear in April, in springtime, in bluebell woods, and they're found all over Europe, but especially in Great Britain and in Ireland. Bluebells are a common indicator species for ancient woodland, and an ancient woodland is defined as any woodland that has existed continuously since at least the year 1600. Native bluebells are protected, and they're protected species under British law, although just to tell you, they weren't protected when I was young, and so when we went round collecting them, that was fine. But it's not fine now, and the reason for this is because so many important woodland sites have been lost to development since the 1950s. It's known that bluebells synthesise a wide range of chemicals within inside their body, and these chemicals have the potential medical properties. For example, bluebells contain at least 15 biologically active compounds that probably provide them with protection against insect and animal consumption. So the bulbs of bluebells have been used in folk medicine for years, and the Romans used to use them as a remedy for infections and to stop bleeding, and the roots were used by folk to make glue. And bluebells can clearly be seen in the famous medieval unicorn tapestries, a famous set of tapestries, and since they're pictured alongside other sex plants and alongside the unicorn himself, then you can be sure that bluebells are also considered to be a symbol of fertility and of marriage. So the wildflower of the week this week, Britain's favourite flower, the bluebell.